Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Our mission here, as always, is to shortcut you to being thoroughly informed. And today, we have a document in front of us that is, without a doubt, one of the most critical pieces of regulation of this decade.
Absolutely.
We're talking about the European Union AI Act. And this isn't just, another piece of legislation. This is shaping up to be a global template for how AI will be governed.
It's truly pioneering. What we're working with today is a really structured guide. It's called EUAIActGuide.pdf, and it's dated April 7, 2025. It meticulously breaks down the final version of the act.
Right.
So for this deep dive, we're going to treat this guide really like a curriculum. We're going to walk you through it chapter by chapter to make sure you get a full structural understanding of this monumental framework.
And our goal is to take this really complex, precautionary framework, which is all about ethical development, transparency, human rights, and give you the actionable nuggets, the timelines, the obligations, and the critical implications, all the things that really define this regulation.
And when you look at the AI Act, you have to recognize the EU's ambition here. They are absolutely aiming for what people call the Brussels effect.
Yes. We saw that with GDPR.
Exactly. Just like GDPR set the global standard for data privacy, the AI Act is really designed to export ethical AI standards all around the world. And it can do that primarily because of its incredibly aggressive reach.
That reach it's a fantastic place to start. I mean, we really can't stress this enough. The territorial scope is just massive.
It is.
If you're sitting there developing an AI system in Silicon Valley or in Tokyo or really anywhere else on the planet, the EU AI Act could still apply directly to you.
That's the key takeaway. The Act's provisions apply no matter where the provider is physically located. If the AI system is placed on the EU market, or if it's put into service inside the EU.
Or even this third one, which is the real kicker.
Right. Or even if the output that is produced by that system is intended to be used within the Union. If that's the case, you are caught by this legislation. And that, immediately creates this massive compliance headache for non-EU companies.
So you can't just operate remotely and think you're safe.
No, not at all. The Act actually mandates that foreign suppliers who fall under its scope have to appoint an authorized representative who is established within the Union.
So you need a footprint in Europe.
You need a formal footprint. This representative acts as the main point of contact for compliance. They have to cooperate with EU authorities. It essentially gives the provider a formal presence, a compliance presence, inside Europe, even if their entire R&D team is thousands of miles away.
Okay, so let's jump right into the core philosophy then. This is the first part of the guide. The AI Act is famous for its risk-focused approach. Why did the EU go this route? Why regulate based on potential harm instead of, regulating the technology itself?
Well, the foundational philosophy is that it's technology neutral. I think they knew that if they tried to regulate a specific algorithm or a specific technique,
It'd be obsolete in 6 months.
Instantly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So instead, they built a framework that categorizes AI systems based on their risk exposure. And it runs a whole spectrum, from minimal risk all the way up to what they call unacceptable risk.
And the philosophy is pretty simple then.
It's very simple. The greater the potential impact on human health, on safety, or on fundamental rights, the stricter the requirements get. Or, in some cases, the more likely the system is just flat out prohibited.
So, in a way, the law is future-proofed against rapid innovation because it focuses on the outcome, not the lines of code.
Precisely. And this is where the ethics are so fundamentally embedded. This whole structure, it builds directly on the 2019 ethical guidelines on trustworthy AI. Any high-risk classification. It requires this stringent analysis of fundamental rights risks, and it explicitly references the rights that are enshrined in the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union. So ethics isn't just an add-on, it is a mandated part of the legal compliance review process.
So to build this whole regulatory house, you need a solid foundation. You need a definition of what you're actually regulating. And the Act is very careful here. It defines the AI system, not intelligence itself. What's the fundamental difference that sets an AI system apart from just, traditional software?
It really boils down to one key ability, the ability to infer. The definition is it's aligned very closely with the OECD's framework, which helps ensure consistency and, technological adaptability.
Okay.
But traditional software, it just operates on predefined explicit rules. If X happens, then do Y. An AI system, especially one built using machine learning, has the capacity to create its own internal rules.
Right.
Or, to put it another way, to infer new rules and new outputs based on the training data that it processes.
So if the system can learn and adapt Beyond the explicit instructions that the human programmer initially gave it, that ability to infer is the trigger. That's what makes it fall under the Act.
That is the foundation. And once you've established you have an AI system, you then have to look at the supply chain concepts. These are the actors that are regulated by the Act.
And there are a few of them.
There are. While the definition lists 6 different categories, you've got providers, importers, distributors, deployers, and so on, most of the really stringent compliance responsibilities, they fall squarely on 2 parties.
Which are?
The provider, which is the entity developing the system and placing it on the market under its own name, and the deployer, which is the entity using the AI system under its authority.
And that distribution of labor. It makes sure accountability doesn't just disappear when the software changes hands.
That's the goal.
Okay, so let's formalize the 4 risk levels that dictate all these responsibilities. This is really the core hierarchy of the whole Act.
It is. This is the essential framework you have to internalize. So at the top, level 1, you have unacceptable risk.
The banned list.
Exactly. These are systems deemed just too detrimental to fundamental rights. Think certain manipulative uses or pervasive surveillance. They're subject to an outright prohibition. We'll get into those later.
Okay.
Second, you have high risk. These are systems that pose a significant risk to health, safety, or fundamental rights. Now, these are permitted, but they face the most stringent requirements for governance, data quality, transparency, the whole 9 yards.
Then you step down a level.
To limited risk. These systems pose a lower risk but still require some basic transparency obligations. A good example is a chatbot or generative AI where the user just needs to know they're dealing with a machine and not a person.
And finally, the bottom tier.
Minimal or no risk. These are, for the most part, unregulated by the Act. Now, they might still fall under general consumer protection or data protection laws like GDPR, but the AI Act itself imposes no specific restrictions on them.
A very clear tiered structure. Now, before we dive into the details of those tiers, let's just touch on the governance. Who's actually running this show at the European level?
The structure is decentralized, but it's highly coordinated. The central body, which acts as this independent hub of expertise, is the European Artificial Intelligence Office, or the AI Office.
Okay, the AI office.
This office is crucial. It's for implementation, monitoring, and it's especially important for handling the most powerful general-purpose AI models.
And what about coordinating across all the different countries?
Well, that's the job of the European Artificial Intelligence Board. This consists of representatives from each of the 27 member states' national authorities, and their job is to ensure consistency in how the Act is applied everywhere.
Understanding that structure, it's critical because organizations need to know who they're reporting to and maybe more importantly, when. So let's look at the crucial implementation timeline. These are the dates you absolutely need to circle on your calendar.
Yes, and it's a staggered application. Failing to meet the earliest deadlines carries the absolute highest risk of fines.
So what's the first date?
February 2, 2025. This date is basically immediate. The ban on all prohibited practices applies, which brings the risk of those maximum 7% fines we talked about. And at the same time, the AI literacy rules in Article 4 also come into force.
Wow, so that's already on the horizon.
Very much so. Then, a bit later, August 2, 2025. This is when the obligations related to general-purpose AI models, or GPAI, begin to apply.
And then the big one.
Then the big one, August 2, 2026. This is when all the other major provisions, including all those extensive and complex requirements for high-risk systems, officially start to apply.
That February 2025 date it's a massive alert. If you're a business that's relying on, say, certain kinds of data scraping techniques or biometric identification, the clock is ticking down right now.
It is ticking very, very fast.
All right, let's move on to Section 2 of the guide. Material and territorial scope. We need to define exactly what is regulated and where those rules apply. So, starting with the material scope, what does this cover beyond just the AI system itself?
Well, the regulation obviously covers AI systems, general-purpose AI models, and of course the prohibited practices. But it's actually much broader. It also regulates the entire supporting ecosystem, meaning the governance structure, the AI board, the AI office, the whole market surveillance framework, the enforcement procedures, and even the mechanisms for innovation support, like the regulatory sandboxes we'll discuss later. It's a complete legal structure built around the technology.
Okay, so with that in mind, let's look closer at those 6 operators we mentioned earlier. The compliance duty really changes dramatically depending on what your role is in the supply chain.
It really does. The key operators are, first, the provider. This is the developer, the entity placing the system on the market under their own name. They carry the primary burden for everything from conformity assessment to ongoing risk management.
And then the end user.
The deployer, often a company or a public body using the system. Their obligations are more centered on oversight, the quality of the data they input, and, critically, conducting impact assessments.
And the others.
You also have the importer, which is the EU-based entity bringing a non-EU system to the market, the distributor, which is anyone else in the supply chain, the product manufacturer, who's relevant when the AI is embedded into a physical product, and finally, that authorized representative we talked about, which is mandatory for non-EU providers.
And to understand when these obligations actually kick in for high-risk systems, we have to define these two trigger points. Placing on the market versus putting into service. What's the difference?
So placing on the market is the very first time a system or model is made commercially available in the EU. Think of it as putting it on the shelf.
Okay.
Putting into service is the moment the AI is supplied for the first time for its intended use by a deployer within the EU. So a system can be placed on the market and then put into service sometime later. Both of those actions trigger obligations for the provider and deployer respectively.
It sounds complex, but it ensures that accountability follows the system from the lab all the way into the real world.
That's the idea.
Now let's address that early obligation we mentioned, the AI literacy requirement. What does Article 4 actually mandate for companies?
This is a really interesting one. It's a broad mandatory obligation for both providers and deployers of any AI system covered by the Act. They have to ensure that their staff, the people dealing with the deployment and use of the system, have a sufficient level of knowledge, skills, and understanding.
Understanding of what, specifically?
Of the system's operation, its opportunities, and, crucially, its risks. The goal here is really to elevate the quality of human oversight.
It's basically a cultural mandate then. But you pointed out a peculiar detail earlier. There are no administrative fines specifically linked to failing this AI literacy obligation.
It's a fascinating legislative choice, isn't it? It suggests that the EU views this less as a kind of penal offense and more as a mandatory prerequisite for responsible operation.
So you won't get fined just for not training your staff?
Not directly, but if a lack of literacy contributes to a serious incident, the harm from that incident would still trigger fines under the other tiers. But the failure to train staff itself is not subject to a direct fine, at least under the current structure.
Interesting. Okay, let's define general purpose AI models, or GPAI, because these required a whole new set of rules to be written into the Act late in the game.
Right. A GPAI model is the AI model itself. It's the foundational component, like a large language model. It's trained with vast amounts of data using self-supervision, and it displays what the Act calls significant generality.
What does that mean in practice?
It means it's capable of performing a wide range of different tasks and is designed to be integrated into a variety of downstream AI systems.
So the core difference is scope. A traditional AI might do one job, like approving loans. A GPAI is highly adaptable.
Exactly. The model is the engine. It still requires a user interface or other software to become the full AI system. The rules recognize that the risks of the engine itself, not just the car it powers, need to be regulated.
With that defined, let's revisit the territorial scope in more detail. We establish it's broad, but what are the three key prongs that establish the EU's jurisdiction here?
Okay, so the Act applies if, 1, the AI system is placed on the EU market or put into service in the EU. That's the straightforward one.
Okay.
2, if a deployer who is located in the EU uses the system. Again, pretty clear.
But the third one is the big one.
The third one is crucial. It applies if the output produced by an AI system operating outside the EU is then used in the EU.
That is the ultimate extraterritorial weapon. So if a data analytics firm in, say, Canada runs an AI system that generates actionable reports, and then those reports are used by their EU clients for critical business decisions.
The Canadian firm is subject to the Act. Precisely. And for GPAI models, the rule is just as encompassing. The provisions apply if the GPAI model is placed on the market or put into service in the EU, regardless of where the provider is located.
Are there any clear exclusions? What activities are deliberately left out of this regulation?
Yes, and these are very important carve-outs. First, activities concerning national security, military, and defense are excluded. These are areas reserved for national law.
But what about dual-use technologies?
Good question. If a dual-use system has a civilian application, that civilian use is regulated.
Okay, what else?
Purely scientific research and development activities and testing and development before a system is placed on the market are also excluded.
Right.
Then you have the household exemption, which applies to individuals using AI for purely personal, non-professional use. So using an AI photo editor for your family pictures is fine.
And the last one is a big one for the tech community.
A huge one. AI systems and models that are released under free and open source licenses are generally excluded. Now, that's unless they are high risk, a prohibited system, or are specifically covered by the transparency obligations. This is designed to protect the open source community from an undue regulatory burden unless what they're building poses a specific high-level risk.
Okay, let's transition to Section 3, Prohibited AI Practices. This is that unacceptable risk category where the EU basically drew a line in the sand, citing threats to fundamental rights. And these are the rules that enter into force first, on February 2, 2025. What's the core theme that unifies all these bans?
The core theme is really about protecting human autonomy, human dignity, and preventing state-sponsored control or manipulation. The prohibitions target 8 very specific practices that are just deemed inherently unsafe or unethical, no matter how well you think you could manage them.
So let's unpack the first one. Prohibition 1, subliminal, manipulative, or deceptive techniques.
This one targets AI systems that are designed to exploit known vulnerabilities through subliminal or deceptive techniques that, and this is the key part, materially distort a person's behavior.
And there's another hurdle it has to clear.
Yes, the key legal trigger is that this distortion must lead to significant harm.
What qualifies as significant harm? This is a bit vague.
The guide clarifies this. It includes adverse impacts on your physical or psychological health or serious financial interests. The Act is also careful to distinguish this from, legal commercial practices like nudging in advertising.
So give me an example.
If a system gently suggests you might like a cheaper product, that's fine. If it uses highly personalized subconscious prompts to induce an elderly person to liquidate their life savings, resulting in a major financial loss that falls squarely under this prohibition, intent and consequence matter immensely.
Okay, that's clear. Next up is Prohibition 2. Exploitation of vulnerabilities. This seems related, but it focuses on specific groups.
It does. This bans exploiting vulnerabilities due to a person's age, their disability, or their specific socioeconomic situation, again, leading to a distortion of behavior and significant harm. It's essentially an attack on predatory algorithms that are designed to target the young, the frail, or the financially desperate.
So here's a question. If an AI system inadvertently harms an already disadvantaged group just because the training data was biased, is that automatically exploitation under this rule?
Not automatically, no. That's a great question. If the harm is purely incidental to bias, it would fall under the high-risk requirements in Section 4, which would force the provider to fix the data quality. But if the provider or the deployer is aware of unlawful discrimination and they can foresee that it will cause significant harm, and yet they take no corrective action, that awareness, combined with the failure to act, could absolutely shift it into the prohibited category of exploitation.
That makes sense.
Oh.
Okay, moving to a very widely discussed prohibition, Prohibition 3, social scoring.
This prohibits classifying individuals based on their social behavior or personal characteristics if that classification results in unfavorable treatment in contexts that are unrelated to where the data was originally generated, or if the treatment is just unjustified or disproportionate.
Can you give us a crystal clear example of the distinction here between prohibited social scoring and something that's allowed, like lawful credit scoring?
Sure. Lawful credit scoring uses your financial data to assess your financial risk for a loan. The context of the data, which is finance, matches the context of the consequence, which is also finance.
Right.
Prohibited social scoring would be, for example, using your real-time social media activity or data on your political donations, which is a totally unrelated context, to determine your eligibility for a job or your access to public housing, or to set your insurance premium. That's an unjustified and unrelated consequence. The Act is trying to prevent the creation of these comprehensive, punitive digital scores that follow you across all facets of your life.
There are also some very strong prohibitions on the use of biometrics. Let's look at Prohibition 5, untargeted scraping of facial recognition databases.
This is a big one. It prohibits the untargeted scraping of facial images from public sources like the internet or CCTV footage for the purpose of creating or expanding facial recognition databases.
So it's about mass collection.
Exactly. It targets mass, indiscriminate data collection designed to build these comprehensive identification tools without anyone's consent or even knowledge. Now, targeted scraping, say, collecting images of specific individuals who are known to authorities, that is allowed. But combining that with untargeted scraping is banned.
And then there's Prohibition 6, inferring emotions in workplaces or education.
This is prohibited, and the reasoning is twofold. The inherent inaccuracy of emotion recognition technology and the power imbalance in those settings. You cannot place or put into service a system designed to measure employee burnout or their mood or their engagement by inferring their emotions.
Are there any exceptions?
There are, but they are extremely narrow. Specific safety reasons, like monitoring a critical operator in a dangerous industrial setting, or for medical therapeutic reasons, but these are interpreted very, very strictly. A system that measures burnout is not exempted.
And finally, probably the most controversial area, Prohibition 8, real-time remote biometric identification, RBI, in public spaces for law enforcement.
This is a near-total ban on using real-time face recognition or other biometrics in publicly accessible spaces. The big concern here is the risk of turning our public spaces into zones of perpetual surveillance.
But there are exceptions for law enforcement.
There are 3 extremely narrow and tightly controlled exceptions. First, for targeted searches for specific victims of serious crimes, like trafficking or abduction. Second, for the prevention of a specific imminent and substantial threat, like a terrorist attack.
And the third?
And third, for identifying a suspect of a serious crime, one that's punishable by at least 4 years in prison.
And what's the administrative hurdle law enforcement has to clear even if they meet one of those exceptions? They can't just flip a switch, can they?
No, absolutely not. They must obtain prior authorization from an independent judicial or administrative authority. This is a critical check and balance. A police agency cannot simply turn on the system whenever they want. They have to justify the necessity and the proportionality of that intrusion to a neutral body, and then they have to notify the national authorities immediately after.
And since these prohibitions are the first to apply, let's just reiterate the fines.
The fines for non-compliance with any of these prohibitions are in the highest tier, up to 35 million or 7% of your annual worldwide turnover, whichever one is higher. And this applies to any operator, provider, deployer, or distributor who's found in violation.
7%. That figure really underscores that the EU considers violating these fundamental rights prohibitions to be even more serious than, say, failing to comply with high-risk system documentation.
It sends a very clear message.
Okay, let's move into Section 4, high-risk AI systems. This is really where the core compliance architecture of the Act lives. These systems are allowed, but they have to meet some incredibly stringent controls. So how are systems classified as high risk? There are 2 distinct legislative pathways to get this classification.
That's right. We use the annexes in the Act as our guide here. First, you have Annex I systems, which are also called safety components.
Okay, what does that mean?
This pathway is linked to existing EU product safety law. So if an AI system is intended to be used as a safety component for products that are already covered by union harmonization legislation, we're talking about machinery, medical devices, civil aviation, cars, it automatically becomes high risk under the AI Act.
So if you make a medical device that uses AI to detect tumors, that AI component is high risk under this rule. Simple as that.
Exactly. And the Act requires that these systems have to undergo a third-party conformity assessment under the relevant product safety rules. They can't just self-certify.
Okay, so that's the first pathway. What's the second?
The second is Annex III systems, which are based on use cases. This is a list that captures 8 critical areas that are focused on fundamental rights protection, regardless of whether the AI is part of a physical product.
And what's on this list?
It includes things like recruitment and HR, for example, scoring candidates or monitoring employees. It includes essential public and private services like evaluating creditworthiness or assigning emergency triage in a hospital. And it also includes crime analytics, law enforcement, and the administration of justice.
So if a company is using AI for something like employee scheduling or performance monitoring, they're squarely in Annex III territory.
Absolutely.
This list is incredibly broad, which leads us to the crucial exemption. This is the key relief valve for industry. When is a system that's listed in Annex III not considered high risk?
This exemption is the Regulatory Balancing Act. A system can be exempt if it performs a function that does not pose a significant risk of harm. The guide cites 4 criteria for this.
Totally.
1, if it performs a very narrow procedural task, like converting a text input into a structured data set. 2, if it merely improves a human activity that's already been completed, like an AI checking for typos in a contract a lawyer has already drafted. 3, if it only detects decision-making patterns or deviations, but it doesn't replace or significantly influence the final human assessment. And 4, if it performs a preparatory task for a human decision, like summarizing a bunch of documents.
That seems like it could be a wide loophole. If my HR system just flags the top 10% of candidates, but a human makes the final call, can I just argue it's a preparatory task?
You might try, but there is a major constraint that severely limits this exemption.
And that is?
The exemption never applies if the system involves the profiling of natural persons. Any system using AI to categorize, assess, or predict individual characteristics in a personalized way, which, by the way, is the definition of profiling under GDPR, cannot use this exemption.
That is a critical insight. Since almost all modern consumer-facing AI systems rely on some form of profiling for personalization, that immediately knocks out a huge number of potential exemptions.
It absolutely does. And you have to remember, the burden of proof is entirely on the provider to demonstrate that the exemption applies. They have to document their assessment and still register the system in the public EU database, even if they claim it's exempted. You can't just silently self-declare. You must document your non-risk status for everyone to see.
Okay, so let's detail the extensive obligations for providers, the sheer volume of compliance work that's required before a high-risk system can even think about affixing that CE marking.
It is a lot. There are 7 core obligations that cover the AI system's entire lifecycle.
Let's run through them.
First, a risk management system. This has to be continuous and documented. Providers have to identify, analyze, and mitigate foreseeable risks before the system is placed on the market, and then continuously update this process as the system evolves.
Second.
Data governance. This is paramount for ethical compliance. Providers must use high-quality, representative, and error-free training, validation, and testing datasets. The specific goal here is to mitigate the risk of unlawful discrimination caused by algorithmic bias.
Okay, number 3.
Documentation and logs. Providers must maintain comprehensive technical documentation throughout the system's lifespan. And high-risk systems must automatically generate logs of their operation, recording every key decision and activity. And these logs have to be kept for at least 6 months to enable traceability if something goes wrong.
What's next?
Transparency and information. Detailed, clear instructions must be provided to the deployer. This has to cover the system's intended purpose, its known limitations, the required human oversight measures, and its expected level of accuracy.
And that leads to human oversight.
Number 5, human oversight. The system has to be designed to allow for human intervention and control to prevent it from automatically causing harm. This is often framed as human in the loop, where a person is directly involved, human on the loop, where they're monitoring, or human in command, where they have the ability to override or shut down the system.
Almost there.
6, accuracy, robustness, and cybersecurity. Providers have to ensure suitable levels of all 3. And cybersecurity requirements could potentially link up to standards set by the EU's Cyber Resilience Act. And finally, 7, the conformity assessment and marking. The provider has to demonstrate compliance through an assessment, and then they can affix the CE marking.
That is some heavy lifting. Now let's talk about the deployers, the end users. Their obligations are different, but they're just as important for real-world accountability. What does a deployer have to do?
Deployers, which are often the companies or public entities actually using the system, have to follow the provider's instructions and implement the right technical and organizational measures. They have to assign personnel with the necessary technical competence for effective human oversight, and they have to ensure the quality of their input data if that data is under their control.
And what about their own staff?
They have to inform affected workers and workers' representatives about the system's deployment.
And there's a huge new duty for deployers of these Annex 3 systems, the Fundamental Rights Impact Assessment, or FRIA. What does that entail?
This is a critical addition. It's mandatory for public authorities and private entities providing public services that use these Annex 3 systems. Before they can put the system into service, they have to perform and document a detailed assessment.
An assessment of what?
It has to detail their own operational processes, the specific categories of people who are likely to be affected by the system, the specific risks to fundamental rights like discrimination or lack of due process, and the measures they've taken for human oversight and risk mitigation. This shifts the focus from purely technical compliance to real-world ethical outcomes.
That is a massive new requirement. Finally on this, let's look at supply chain responsibility. If an importer or even a deployer modifies the system, they can become the new provider. How does that shift in liability work?
Right. So if a party downstream, an importer, a distributor, or a deployer, takes certain actions, they suddenly assume the full, massive compliance burden of the original provider.
What actions trigger that?
Things like affixing their own name or trademark to the system, making a substantial modification that affects compliance and wasn't foreseen by the original provider, or changing the system's intended use in a way that makes it high risk. Once you make that kind of modification, you are responsible for meeting all the risk management, data governance, and documentation requirements of a provider.
So you can't just buy a compliant system and then tweak it into a dangerous one without taking on the liability yourself.
Exactly. It closes that loophole.
Okay, we're moving now to Section 5, General Purpose AI Models, or GPAI. As you noted earlier, the original AI Act structure was really built around specific use cases, but then the explosion of LLMs like GPT or Gemini forced this last-minute legislative scramble. What was the core challenge that these models posed to the original framework?
The challenge was, in a word, polyvalence. The original act assumed a model had a fixed, known intended purpose. You had a system for hiring or a system for medical diagnosis. GPAI models, however, are foundation models that can be adapted for thousands of unforeseen purposes downstream.
So regulating the specific system wasn't enough.
It wasn't enough. The EU realized they had to regulate the model itself to anticipate these emergent risks that could pop up anywhere.
So the regulation now splits its focus, and we have to reiterate the terminology distinction here. Model versus system.
Right. A GPAI model is the core component. It's the raw engine trained on data. The rules regulate the provider of this model. A GPAI system is the actual end-user product that's built upon that model, which then falls under the high-risk or transparency requirements if it's used for a specific purpose.
Okay, so with that distinction in mind, what are the obligations for all GPAI providers, regardless of their perceived risk level?
Even a standard, non-systemic GTI provider has 4 key obligations, and they're all centered on transparency.
Let's hear them.
First, documentation. They have to prepare technical documentation, which is detailed in Annex XI, covering the training process, testing results, architecture, and this has to be accessible to the AI office. Second, transparency to downstream providers. This is crucial. They have to make key information detailed in Annex 12 available to the system providers who integrate their model.
Why is that so important?
It's so the downstream users can know the model's limitations and can comply with their high-risk obligations. The Act does try to balance this against protecting confidential IP, but the information flow is mandatory.
Number 3.
A copyright compliance policy. Providers have to establish a clear policy to comply with EU copyright law, and this specifically has to address the right for copyright holders to opt out of text and data mining, which is a right under the EU Copyright Directive.
And the last one.
A public data summary. They must prepare and publicly share a detailed summary of the training data they used. This provides transparency on potential input biases, and it allows stakeholders to exercise their rights regarding how their data was used.
So these rules ensure that even the foundational layer of AI development is compliant with EU intellectual property and data rights. Now let's talk about the superpowered models, those with heightened obligations for systemic risk. How is systemic risk actually defined?
Systemic risk means the model poses major society-level risks, things like the widespread dissemination of fraudulent content, serious consequences for critical infrastructure, or even major economic instability.
And how do they identify one of these moderate?
A model is automatically presumed to have high-impact capabilities and therefore systemic risk if it meets a specific technical threshold.
Let's nail that down. What is the key benchmark that the regulator has set?
The threshold is training with more than 10 to the power of 25 floating point operations, or FLOPs.
Can we just pause and clarify that number?
Yeah.
Because it's very abstract, 10 to the 25th. What is the FLOP and why is that the benchmark?
Right. A FLOP, a floating point operation, is a single calculation performed by a computer, usually involving real numbers. When you talk about 10 to the 25 FLOPs, you are talking about a truly astronomical amount of computational energy required to train the model.
So this number is the EU's proxy for measuring...
What? For measuring high-impact capabilities. Only the very largest frontier models currently meet this threshold, because it correlates directly with a model's complexity, its generality, and its resource intensity. It's a huge number.
So it's basically a hardware-based metric that's being used to assess software risk. If a provider hits that level, what is their immediate notification duty?
They have to notify the commission without delay, at the latest within 2 weeks of hitting that massive computational requirement. And once they're classified as systemic, they face significantly additional obligations.
Legit.
More rigorous model evaluation and testing procedures. Mandatory systemic risk assessment and mitigation plans. They have to implement advanced cybersecurity protections. And they have to have extensive incident management and reporting procedures specifically for systemic failures.
So this regulatory tier basically ensures that the organizations controlling the most powerful cognitive engines on the planet face the most intense scrutiny from a centralized body, the AI office.
Yes, that's exactly right.
Okay, Section 6 focuses on transparency obligations. Now, these apply primarily to the limited risk systems we talked about, but they're also necessary across the board to build public trust. What is the fundamental goal of these transparency rules?
The goal really is to ensure that you, the user, know when you are interacting with or consuming content that was generated by AI. This enables human oversight, it allows for informed decision-making, and it's a key tool to combat misinformation.
The Act identifies 4 specific types of systems that require transparency under Article 50. Let's start with chatbots, or any system designed for direct interaction.
For these, the provider must clearly inform the individual that they are interacting with an AI system. The only exemption here is if it's obvious to a reasonably well-informed person that the interaction is with a machine.
So if a virtual assistant clearly states its AI nature or has a robot voice, you're probably covered.
Exactly. Or if it has no human characteristics whatsoever.
Okay, next up, AI-generated synthetic content.
This applies to any content created by AI images, audio, video, or text. The providers have to ensure this content is marked in machine-readable format to indicate that it's been artificially created or manipulated. And this goes beyond just a simple disclaimer at the bottom of the page.
What are the technical mechanisms for this machine-readable marking? How does that work?
Well, the guide details several methods. You've got metadata, which is embedding information within the file's properties, although that can be relatively easy to strip out.
Right.
You also have watermarks, which can be visible or invisible. Algorithmic fingerprints, which are unique traces left in the content that can be detected by verification tools. And cryptographic signatures, which are digital stamps that can prove the content's origin and verify it hasn't been altered. The intent here is to be robust and verifiable.
Okay, let's look at the obligations for systems that observe human behavior. Emotion recognition or biometric categorization systems.
For these, the deployers, the ones using the systems, must inform the people who are exposed to them that they are being subject to this technology. This is a mandatory notice, just acknowledging that their biometric data is being processed to infer their emotions or to categorize them by, say, gender or age group.
And finally, the really critical rule regarding deepfakes, or the manipulation of images, audio, and video.
Here, the deployer, so the person or entity that's distributing the deepfake, must clearly and distinguishably label the content as artificial or manipulated if it significantly resembles real entities and could mislead people into believing it's authentic.
Are there artistic exemptions for deepfakes? I mean, they're used all the time in media and entertainment.
Yes, there are. The requirements are relaxed for artistic, creative, satirical, or fictional works. Disclosures still have to be made, but it can be done in a way that doesn't disrupt the viewing experience. For example, a note in the description or a subtle, non-intrusive watermark is often enough, provided the work has also undergone some kind of human review or editorial control.
And it's worth noting the regulatory overlap here, right? These rules don't exist in a vacuum.
Not at all. These transparency mandates significantly support the Digital Services Act, the DSA. The machine-readable markings allow very large online platforms, or VLOPs, to automatically identify and prioritize deepfakes for risk mitigation. It ensures a coordinated regulatory approach across the entire digital spectrum.
All right, Section 7 introduces regulatory sandboxes, which are the EU's main mechanism for trying to foster innovation while still maintaining control. What exactly is an AI regulatory sandbox?
It's defined as a controlled framework where innovative AI systems can be developed, trained, validated, and tested. This can happen in real-world conditions, but it's under the close supervision of a national competent authority and for a strictly limited period of time.
And what are the dual objectives of setting up these sandboxes? It seems like there are two sides to it.
There are. On one hand, they're meant to accelerate market access for cutting-edge AI and provide legal certainty for innovators. But on the other hand, they serve as learning tools for the regulators themselves, helping them understand the opportunities and the emerging risks of new technologies before they hit the mass market.
Is the creation of these sandboxes optional for the member states?
No, it is a mandate. Each member state must establish at least one AI regulatory sandbox by August 2, 2026.
And are there any specific incentives for the smaller players like SMEs and startups to get involved?
Absolutely. The Act mandates that access to these sandboxes should generally be free of charge for SMEs and startups, and they are supposed to receive priority access. This is a very deliberate measure to prevent the regulatory burden from stifling smaller companies that might not have the capital for expensive external compliance consulting.
So, if a new AI system is being tested in one of these sandboxes and it malfunctions and causes some harm, who is liable?
The participants remain fully liable for any harm that's inflicted on third parties under civil law, so you can still be sued. However, here's the incentive. Administrative fines will not be imposed if they observe the agreed-upon testing plan and they follow the regulatory guidance in good faith.
So it allows innovators to fail safely from a regulatory perspective.
Exactly, without facing massive regulatory penalties. But they remain financially accountable for any damage they cause.
Given the sensitivity of AI training, how are personal data rules handled within a sandbox environment? That seems like a minefield.
It is. The processing of lawfully collected personal data is allowed, but only under highly restricted conditions. It's only permitted if the AI system is aiming to safeguard a substantial public interest, like public health,
Ah,
and if synthetic or anonymized data cannot reasonably be used as a substitute. And crucially, the data has to be handled in a separate protected environment that's subject to heightened technical security measures. This ensures that GDPR rights are protected even during this accelerated testing phase.
The Act also allows for real-world testing of AI systems even outside of a formal sandbox. What are the key constraints on that kind of testing?
This is for temporary testing of the system's intended purpose, but outside a laboratory environment. And it is subject to very strict conditions.
For example.
It requires approval from the relevant market surveillance authority. It has to be registered in the EU database. The testing is limited to a maximum of 6 months, though it can be extended once. All the participants have to provide explicit informed consent. And the outcomes of the testing must be reversible or capable of being disregarded.
This allowance for national testing seems like it could introduce a potential complication.
It could. It introduces the risk of what's known as forum shopping. Since member states are implementing these sandboxes at the national level, providers might start to look for jurisdictions that are perceived as having the most industry-friendly or lenient testing approaches. And that could potentially create regulatory divergence despite the EU's overall goal of harmonization.
Okay, on to the critical Section 8. Enforcement and governance. Once a high-risk system is deployed, the obligations don't just end there. What are the post-marketing obligations for providers of high-risk systems?
Right. High-risk systems require continuous monitoring because they can learn, they can adapt, and their risk profile can change over time. So providers have to establish and implement a post-market monitoring plan. This plan has to be proportionate to the system's risk, and it must actively collect, document, and analyze performance data throughout the AI system's entire lifetime.
So it's about ongoing compliance.
It is. And it's meant to identify potential emergent risks. The Commission is actually due to provide a template for this monitoring plan via an implementing act by February 2, 2026.
And if something goes seriously wrong, there's an emergency protocol. Serious incident reporting. What defines a serious incident, and how fast does the provider have to report it?
A serious incident is defined as something that includes death, serious harm to health, a serious disruption to critical infrastructure, a fundamental rights violation, or serious harm to property or the environment.
And the timelines.
The reporting timelines are extremely aggressive. It's immediate, with a maximum of 2 days for a widespread infringement or a critical infrastructure disruption. It's 10 days if the incident involves the death of a person. And it's 15 days for all other serious incidents.
Is that realistic for a global company? I mean, how can a provider based in the US or Asia possibly meet a 48-hour deadline, especially since they have to report this to the market surveillance authorities in all of the affected member states?
That is the major practical challenge. The Act does recognize the difficulty, which is why the Commission is going to issue specific guidelines on serious incident reporting by August 2, 2025. But as the text stands now, it requires near instantaneous, simultaneous reporting to multiple authorities. Companies need to have incredibly robust global incident response procedures in place.
And who are these market surveillance authorities, or MSAs, that handle the enforcement at the national level?
Member states have to designate their MSAs by August 2, 2025. And there's a key provision here to ensure accountability. For high-risk systems that involve biometrics, law enforcement, migration, and justice, those really sensitive fundamental rights areas, the MSAs must be the existing National Data Protection Authorities, or DPAs.
Which leverages their existing expertise.
Exactly. It leverages the DPA's existing expertise in rights protection.
The MSAs have tremendous powers. What is the most intrusive power the Act grants them to ensure a system is conforming to the rules?
They have very broad powers to demand documentation, but the most powerful is the ability to compel disclosure of the AI system's foundational elements. They can demand access to the training, validation, and testing datasets that were used for development.
And it goes even further than that.
It does. If the documentation proves to be insufficient, they can compel the disclosure of the source code itself.
Access to the source code that goes directly to a company's intellectual property. It momentarily overrides trade secret protection in the interest of public safety and fundamental rights.
It is the ultimate sanction, yes. Now, for the super models, the general-purpose AI models, the enforcement structure changes dramatically.
Right, we noted the centralization. Who has exclusive authority here?
The European Commission, acting through the AI Office, has exclusive power for the supervision and enforcement over GPAI providers. This centralized approach is meant to ensure a consistent, highly technical assessment of these rapidly evolving, complex models.
And there's a bottom-up mechanism, too.
Yes. GPAI deployers have a right to lodge complaints directly to the AI Office, which provides a way to alert the central regulator to potential problems from the ground up.
So let's review the penalties, the tiered structure of the administrative fines.
The AI Act fines are tiered based on the nature of the violation, and they can be huge. First, for prohibited practices, the most severe. That's up to $35 million or 7% of annual worldwide turnover.
Wow. And the next tier?
For violating high-risk obligations, failing to comply with data governance, risk management, documentation requirements, that's up to $15 million or 3% of annual worldwide turnover.
And the lowest tier?
For supplying incorrect information to authorities, that's up to $7.5 million or 1% of annual worldwide turnover.
And what about remedies for third parties? What new rights are granted to individuals by the Act?
The Act establishes a new complaint mechanism that allows any natural or legal person to submit a complaint to the MSA regarding an alleged infringement. And this is actually broader than the personal data complaints under GDPR.
And what about the specific right to explanation?
This is a big one. Any person who is affected by a decision made by a high-risk AI system that has legal or similarly significant effects on them is entitled to a clear and meaningful explanation from the deployer. This goes beyond the transparency requirements in GDPR by mandating that deployers have to detail how the AI system reached its conclusion, which empowers individuals to challenge adverse decisions.
Okay, we've established that the AI Act is really a framework, a living regulation, that requires continuous monitoring of all this subsequent legislative action. What are the key secondary tools the EU is going to use to fill in all the technical details?
There are 3 main legislative tools and 2 operational ones. First, you have delegated acts. The Commission has the power for 5 years to adopt these to quickly amend the annexes and the technical thresholds without going through the full legislative process.
So they can use these to adjust the GPII FLOP's threshold.
And update the list of high-risk use cases in Annex 3 as the technology evolves. Exactly.
Okay, second.
Second, implementing acts. These are used to create uniform practical conditions. They'll be used to detail the procedures for sandboxes, to finalize the GPAI enforcement mechanisms, and to establish common specifications for high-risk requirements. We know that the template for the post-market monitoring plan, for example, will be delivered via an implementing act by February 2, 2026.
Then you have the non-binding guides, Commission guidelines.
Yes, and these are practical, explanatory documents that are essential for day-to-day compliance. The key guidelines we're expecting include practical examples of high-risk versus non-high-risk systems, which are due by February 2, 2026, detailed guidance on the transparency obligations, and clarification on what constitutes a substantial modification to an AI system.
And how does industry itself contribute to defining compliance? Through codes of conduct and practice.
Right. These are often voluntary, and they provide technical details on how to comply with the high-level obligations. The most urgent one right now is the codes of practice for GPAI models. Stakeholders are racing to draw up the first code, which is due by May 2, 2025. If they succeed, it provides technical clarity. If they fail, the Commission can step in and mandate binding rules via an implementing act.
And for high-risk systems, compliance really hinges on achieving this presumption of conformity through standards.
Yes. Harmonized technical standards, which are developed by European standardization organizations, are absolutely vital. If a high-risk system complies with the published standards covering things like risk management and data governance, it achieves this presumption of conformity, which allows the provider to affix the CE marking much more efficiently.
Finally, let's tie compliance into civil damages. The AI Liability Directive, or ALE. How does this proposal relate to the AI Act?
The AILD is the crucial civil liability piece of the puzzle. It addresses how victims can claim damages when they've been harmed by an AI system. The proposal has been updated to align perfectly with the AI Act's terminology and obligations.
And what's the critical link?
The critical link is that the AILD proposal creates a presumption that deployers are liable for damage if they fail to comply with their AI Act obligations. Specifically, things like failing to monitor the system or failing to use sufficiently representative input data. This directly connects regulatory negligence to civil liability, and it really completes the accountability loop.
We have covered an immense amount of detail across the 9 core structures of the EU AI Act. To consolidate all this knowledge, what are the absolute most critical takeaways for you, the listener, to carry forward from this?
I would say focus on 3 things. First, classification is destiny. Your compliance burden, your documentation requirements, and your fine exposure are all entirely dictated by whether your system is classified as prohibited, which is that 7% fine exposure, high risk, which is 3%, or limited risk. You have to get that classification right immediately.
Okay, that's number 1.
Second, the early warning deadline. For a moment, ignore the August 2026 date for high-risk systems. The immediate regulatory threat is the February 2, 2025 application date for all of the prohibited practices. If you are involved in any form of manipulative scraping or unlawful social scoring, you have to cease those operations now.
And the third takeaway.
Global accountability. It doesn't matter if you're building an LLM in the US or using an AI HR system in Brazil. If that system's output is used in the EU, you are subject to this law. Compliance is now a global prerequisite for market access.
And as we've seen, this is not a static law. Compliance requires constantly monitoring standards, guidelines, and delegated acts that haven't even been finalized yet.
Indeed. It's a regulatory roadmap that is still being built as we speak. And on that note, let's leave you with one final thought, something that looks past the immediate deadlines and into the long-term impact of this pioneering legislation.
Lay it on us.
The AI Act mandates that the Commission has to review the development of standardization deliverables that are focused on the energy efficiency of GPAI models, and they have to assess the need for further binding measures by 2028. Now, we know that training the largest LLMs requires an astronomical amount of computing power. That 10 to the 25 FLOPs metric is really a stand-in for massive energy consumption.
So if the EU decides that energy efficiency has to become a binding compliance obligation by 2028, what might those energy-focused binding measures actually look like? And how could linking AI development directly to environmental sustainability requirements fundamentally change the economics, the competitive viability of training the next generation of truly massive frontier AI models? It's a challenge that could reshape the entire industry based on a single clause and a very long regulation. That is a fascinating strategic question for every major AI developer to be considering right now. Thank you for guiding us through this essential deep dive into the EU AI Act.
My pleasure.
And thank you for joining us on the deep dive. We'll see you next time.